Welcome to Fruity Knitting. I'm Madeline.
And I'm Andrea.
And this is episode 142. Fruity Knitting is a 90-minute program that brings you knitting inspiration from around the world, as well as some extra snippets of travel, history, and storytelling that we hope adds joy to your life and brings a smile to your face.
And I'm really excited about our program today. I think you're going to enjoy it as well because I have excellent news. We now have scientific evidence supporting why we should be spending our time knitting. And that's the topic of our feature interview. So Dr. Anne Kirketerp is a Danish psychologist and researcher who's recently published a book called Craft Psychology. And just to cut a long story short, Dr. Kirketerp found that she's one of the few people educated both as a fully trained craft person and as a doctor of psychology. And during her research, she saw that there's well over 50,000 published scientific articles linking physical exercise with mental well-being and overall health. But in contrast, there's only around 400 published scientific articles linking crafting with mental well-being and overall health. So if someone has a problem, it's very easy for doctors and psychologists to prescribe some form of physical exercise because there's a ton of scientific evidence supporting the benefits. But as a crafter, Dr. Kirketerp knew firsthand, just like we all intuitively know, how good crafting is for our mental well-being and health. So she made it her mission to enhance the scientific evidence that crafting really does promote mental well-being and health. And this should make it much easier in the future for psychologists and doctors to prescribe specific forms of crafting for their patients with ailments like anxiety or early onset dementia, rehab after an accident, and even eating disorders. And what's additionally brilliant about crafting, and in our case knitting, is that it's passion driven, which means there should be high patient compliance, which is often not the case with prescribed physical exercise. So once you help somebody find a craft that really suits them, try telling them to stop doing it. You won't have any luck. They're just going to do it in secret.
Yeah. And because I studied psychology, I actually got to do this interview, which was a great experience for me. And I also learned a lot through reading her book. It's called Craft Psychology.
Yeah, this was the absolute perfect interview for you to do, and I was totally thrilled that you could do it.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
And then in Knitters of the World, we're going to the south of France to meet the designer behind YarnFlakes, who's Audrey Barbroe.
On top of that, we have a fashion show for you, some updates on our knitting projects, and a crazy comedy of errors tutorial with Mum that I think we're going to start with now.
Yeah. So in the last episode, I showed you my latest project, which is the Lola pullover by Claudia Quintanilla, who we interviewed in episode 140. And I was feeling so happy with this project because it was just flying off the needles, and I proudly held it up for you to show you, having finished the body with just 2 sleeves to go. And I didn't speak much about the details of the design, but I did predict that I would have it finished and would be sitting here in this episode wearing it for you. And then shortly after we released that episode, I was just scrolling through the comments, just checking them out, and I came across a comment that said, "Is it just me, or is there a mistake in Andrea's latest project? Directly at the underarms, going across the chest, there seems to be a mistake in the all-over lace pattern repeat." And so I scrolled down further, and more comments came in saying, "Yes, you're right. I can see it too. There's definitely a mistake in the lace pattern repeat." And I thought, what the heck? Can this really be true? So I raced over and got my knitting and laid it out. And sure enough, directly at the underarms, going across the chest, was an obvious mistake in the all-over lace pattern repeat, which I had previously not noticed at all. So here's a picture of the design, and it has an intricate all-over lace pattern, which I'd describe as wagon wheel pattern with a staggered offset. So what I call the wagon wheels are arranged in vertical rows, but each subsequent row is offset from the previous one, and that creates a staggered effect. And right across the chest, directly at the underarms, is my mistake. I have 2 wagon wheels squashed together. And I think it just happened when I put the sleeves on hold and joined the body in the round, because I must have started on the wrong pattern row. And because the design is knitted top down, if I was going to fix the mistake in the traditional way, I'd have to rip back most of my work. So this was really quite depressing, and I did spend quite some time looking at it from a distance without my glasses on, trying to convince myself that if it wasn't pointed out to you, you wouldn't really notice it. And we all know the saying that if you can't see a mistake when you're passing by on a galloping horse, then it doesn't matter and you can just leave it.
Did you get that in Pony Club?
No, that's a common knitter expression.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it doesn't give you any comfort whatsoever, because we all know that when you're sitting on a galloping horse, you're just trying to stay on the animal and you can't see anything anyway. And then we had our live knit and chat evening with our Shetland patrons. And on that particular evening, quite a few of the patrons very kindly said to me how inspired they were that I would always rip back my knitting and keep reworking it until it looked really good and fitted me perfectly. And I thought, oh my goodness, the pressure's on. I'm really going to have to fix up this stupid mistake.
Yeah. It's your stellar reputation as your downfall, Mum.
Yes. So I have done a couple of tutorials on fixing mistakes in your sweater by cutting it open and then lengthening it or shortening it and then grafting it back together, either in stocking stitch, ribbing or garter stitch. And for that, it's not actually as complicated as you might think. Often you just insert your needles into the 2 rows that you want to end up grafting together, and you're doing this so that your stitches are safe before you actually cut your knitting open. And then you unravel your work until you have the correct length or until the mistake is gone, and then you graft the 2 halves together again. But I'd never done this before in an all-over complicated lace pattern, and I did spend just a couple of days trying to imagine how I might do it and how it might look like if I did cut it open. And I was really oscillating between thinking maybe I can manage it and thinking no way, it's way too impossible. Mm-hmm. Because firstly, I couldn't find a single row. I couldn't pick out a single row where I could thread my needle through all of the stitches because the yarn path was too complicated and I couldn't be sure that I was picking up all the stitches in the same row and not leaving some out and picking up some from the row below or the row above. And then, so that was a problem. And then secondly, so I need your hands for this. Yes. The top is knitted top down, so it's actually knitted in this direction. It's knitted in this direction here. So if I was to cut my knitting open, I could slowly unravel this bottom part until I got all of the stitches in the same row correctly back on my needles, and I could recognize that pattern row. So I was confident that I'd be able to manage this half. But this top half, I would be unraveling from below the stitches, which is not the natural way to do it. And you can't just naturally unravel like this. It has a very complicated going in on itself, back on itself yarn path. And with all of the knit threes together and yarn overs, I wasn't sure would I even recognize what pattern row I'm on, and could I actually unpick. So I had no imagination of how that would work on the top. That was my big risk. And then thirdly, I'm knitting with a fingering weight and a sticky mohair held together. And I wasn't sure even if I cut my knitting open and I couldn't make my way to grafting it back together again, could I unrip this bit here? And if I did, I'd be unripping it from the bottom down, which is the natural way of doing it. Would I be
We're holding it the wrong way.
From the top down. Yeah. Okay.
No.
So no, just wait a minute. So this is the way that the knitting is knitted up.
Yeah.
I'd be cutting it open here. If I want to unrip this section here, I would be doing it in the correct way, which is down this way. But would that work with a sticky mohair? Because sometimes sticky mohair it's awful to unpick. That's the first concern. And then secondly, would I be able to reuse the yarn? Because normally when you rip back yarn that you've already used, it's all curly. And what you need to do is wash it and dry it so it becomes straight again. Otherwise, if you knit straight back with curly yarn, your tension looks worse than a beginner's. It's all lumpy, bumpy and all over the place.
And that doesn't go away when you block it?
No, because you're knitting, certain stitches will just be really looser because they've got a curl in them.
Yeah.
So no, it doesn't go away. But there was no way that I was going to wash 2 different skeins, particularly a sticky mohair. So I thought, okay, I will make an experiment. At that stage, I was still knitting a sleeve, and I thought I will rip back my sleeve a good section and see, first of all, can I rip back easily? And secondly, I'll knit it straight back again with the curly yarn and see, is there a problem in my tension? And because this is a complicated all over very lacy pattern, there was no difference in my tension. You couldn't see anything at all. So
you're incredibly conscientious, Mum.
No, it's not conscientious. I just wanted to minimize my risks or explore the risk, do a risk analysis.
Yeah.
So I got confidence through that. I thought, okay, because I don't have enough yarn not to use yarn if I can't put it back together. So that gave me confidence. And then on top of that, I thought, okay, if all goes really poorly, can't graft it back together again, or even if I just did it the traditional way, which is to unpick all the way down here, fix the mistake and re-knit it, how long would that actually take me? And it's hard to always say because I never time myself when I'm knitting, but I would say at a guess, maybe 10 hours. So I thought, okay, then I really can afford to take the risk, cut my knitting open and see what happens, because maybe I'll learn something. So the lace pattern has a 12-row pattern repeat, and I looked closely and decided which 2 pattern rows I would choose to graft together with the stocking stitch, because every second row is stocking stitch, which is a really good thing for me. So I would be grafting one pattern row into another pattern row using stocking stitch. And I chose to graft row 5 to row 7, which you can see here, and you're working the chart upwards. So that meant I would have completed row 5 on my bottom needle, and row 5 is harder because it has more yarn overs and knit threes together. And then I would be grafting into row 7, which is the most simple row. And I thought that would give me the best chance of getting it right. So that was my only plan. I thought I'll just sit down, I'll cut it open, and I'll figure out what I'm doing as I'm doing it. So what's coming up now is not a tutorial, it's more like an experiment caught on camera. And I hope you find it interesting. The Lola pullover has an intricate all-over lace pattern that I would describe as a wagon wheel pattern with a staggered offset. And my mistake is right across the chest, directly at the underarms. I have 2 wagon wheels squashed together. Because the lace pattern is really busy, I realised that once I cut open my sweater, I could have difficulty lining up the 2 halves correctly again. So to avoid this potential problem, I threaded a contrasting strand of yarn through the centre of a few wagon wheels on 2 different rows. After I have cut the garment in 2, I'll know that the centre of the wagon wheels will have to line up again vertically. I turned the garment upside down because it was knitted top down, and this way my stitches are presented in the direction that they were knitted in. And to fix my mistake, I will cut and unpick a row that is a few rows above my mistake. In case I make a mistake while unpicking, I will still have a few more rows underneath that I can unravel to ensure I pick up all the stitches in the correctly in the same row. So I then pull out a stitch to make it loose and cut it and begin to slowly unravel. And as I unravel, I thread the stitches on the lower piece onto a needle. And this might look really slow and painful, but unraveling each stitch helped me understand the yarn path and read my knitting better. And this slowly gave me more confidence that it could actually work out. So I finally finished separating the 2 halves. I had all the stitches on the bottom half correctly on my needle. I then knitted up to and completed row 5 of the pattern as planned. And next, I picked up and secured all the live stitches on the top half, and this was harder to do because the yarn didn't unravel easily as I was unraveling from the bottom of the stitches. So eventually I had both sections on the needles with all the stitches placed in the correct direction on the needle. I had completed row 5 on my first needle and row 7 on my second needle, and to my surprise this worked out really well. I could read all the stitches. So I have 92 stitches on each needle, and it should be simple now just to join them together with a row of grafted knit stitches. So I did a little victory dance and squealed, and then I got started with the grafting mantra of knit off, purl on, knit on, etc. So I was in the middle of grafting when I decided to take a break and verify my work. But to my dismay, I noticed that the pattern wasn't aligning correctly. The bottom half of the work was positioned too far to the right. I just couldn't believe it. So I had to undo everything and start again. This was really frustrating. It was already 10 p.m. at night and I felt like crying, so I just decided to go to bed. In the morning, I unpicked everything and looked really closely at the sequence of stitches on both needles. And I discovered that in the process of grafting, I had dropped a couple of stitches, which wasn't easy to spot because they were yarn overs. And I then realized that I really needed to know the exact stitch pattern sequence on both needles so that I could double check as I went along. So I found it easier to graft the front and back separately with a separate piece of yarn for each side. And when you're cleaning up your grafting row, it's actually easier to tidy up the grafted row from both ends. So I used a piece of yarn approximately 4 times the length of the stitches to be grafted on each side. And to fix the grafting tension, I went through and pulled each leg of every stitch with my needle, correcting the tension just stitch by stitch. So here's the Lola top grafted successfully together again. I can totally understand if you think this was a terribly painful procedure, because I did for most of the time as well. But do remember that it took me way less time than if I had to re-knit the whole back and front again. And I think I've learned a lot through the process. So that just has to be the biggest comedy of errors possible, except for it doesn't have a happy ending, so it's a tragedy of errors.
That's a tragic comedy.
A tragic comedy. So what happened is when I finished, I wasn't happy with my grafting row because I thought the tension just looked too tight, but I knew that that wasn't the case, that had extra special care not to make the tension tight. So I couldn't figure out, why is it looking so bad? And then I looked really closer and I realized that I grafted row 5 to row 3, not to row 7. And row 3 and 7 are identical, they're just offset. So that's why I was thinking I was doing it to row 7. And I just felt like such a fool because I'd managed to do all the tricky stuff correctly. So I'd managed to cut my knitting open and get both halves successfully back on the needles on what I thought were the correct rows. And then after multiple attempts, I managed to line up the grafting so it was absolutely perfectly together and good grafting, only to find that I grafted the wrong 2 rows together, and now it's only a slight improvement on how it was before.
I think it's a big improvement still, and I was so proud of Mum. She put so much effort into it. It looked so complicated. I didn't even notice the mistake, to be honest, the second time around.
Anyway, so I felt like quite a fool, but I haven't darned in my ends yet. So there is the slimmest possibility that in the future that I might gain enough mental energy and perseverance to open it up again and try to correctly graft the 2 correct rows together. But I'm more inclined just simply to leave it the way it is and wear it as a garment with a story.
Yeah. Well, I've actually been having a pretty frustrating time with my Barbroe blouse as well. So this is the body of the Barbroe blouse. Yeah, you hold that for me. You knit it from the bottom up and in the round, and then when you reach the armholes, you divide the body into the front and back and knit them flat, and then finally you graft them at the shoulder seams. So I did this, as you can see, but then I realized too late that I'd actually made a mistake because my right strap is a lot longer than the left strap. And you can see that I accidentally left out 2.5 pattern repeats when I was knitting the left half of the back from the keyhole upwards. So my left keyhole is a lot shorter
yes, they're
than
meant
the right
to join.
keyhole. Yeah. But because I was so keen on making progress, I actually didn't unpick the grafting and fix my mistake immediately. Well, I still haven't done it. Instead, I moved on to the sleeves. And I'm sad to say that since I started the sleeves, I've also made multiple mistakes on the sleeves.
Were you hoping that I would fix this up for you?
You offered. You
I
actually offered. And you haven't done it yet.
You should let me. I'll unpick it for you.
Yeah.
So you've got that over and done with.
I'd love that.
Then you just need to knit it.
Yeah. Well, mistakes on the sleeves. Now, I want to make one more comment. This year was definitely carelessness on my part. I take full responsibility. But with the sleeves, I actually reread the instructions over and over again because it wasn't very clear to me what exactly the pattern wanted from me on a few points. And now, as you can see, I'm still on my first sleeve and I've re-knitted it multiple times. So it's a bit disheartening. The sleeves are tapered, which means that for my size, every 16 rows you increase by 2 stitches so that the sleeve gets wider as you go up the arm. It's pretty obvious. But my challenge was to know when and how to integrate those extra stitches into a new pattern repeat. And I'm going to show you a close-up picture of Mum's beautiful finished Barbroe blouse sleeve and my almost finished Barbroe blouse sleeve so that you can see what I mean. So while I was knitting, I set a marker for the beginning of the row and increased on either side of the marker, like the pattern told me to. The instructions say, each time 8 stitches have been increased, work these into the stitch pattern. So I thought I had to wait until there were 8 stitches on either side of the marker before turning them into a new lace pattern repeat, because this would keep the symmetry on either side of the sleeve seam. But when I compared my sleeve to Mum's finished sleeve, I saw that she had only waited to have 4 stitches on either side of the marker, and then she would move her marker forward and turn the 8 new increased stitches into a new pattern repeat. So Mum did this twice as often as I did, which integrated the new stitches more smoothly, and I really do think her sleeve looks much better than mine. When I tried my sleeve on, Mum kindly pointed out to me that the inside of the sleeve looks like alligator skin, and I am inclined to agree with her.
That sounds rather mean, but it was true.
It was very true, yeah. And yeah, so I'm pretty disappointed that I'm still working on the first sleeve. I was really looking forward to having a finished project to show you, and the Barbroe blouse is such a beautiful top. So, yeah.
Yeah. Do you know what I just thought? This whole episode is about how crafting and knitting really improves your mental health. But Madeline and I are really not good advocates of it in this episode.
No, we're both going to have a mental breakdown.
Yeah, we're having a mental breakdown with our knitting. Okay, so that's quite funny and ironic that it happens in this episode.
Yeah.
But the thing is, you are more than halfway done. And
I was more than halfway done last episode.
I know. But anyway, what we did recently was film a fashion shoot of Madeline modelling my version of the Barbroe blouse together with her finished Florence bag by PetiteKnit.
Yeah.
And you looked absolutely stunning in it. And that did give you some encouragement just to keep persevering and finishing yours.
Yes, it's worth it.
So the fashion shoot's coming up now.
Sugar, I call my baby my sugar. I never may be my sugar. That's why my baby is so confectionery funny. I never plead for his money, 'cause when I feed him on honey, I get my needs every time. I'd make 1,000,000 trips to his lips if I were a bee, 'cause they are sweeter than any candy to me. He is granulated sugar. I never cheat on my sugar, 'cause I'm too sweet on my sugar. And that sugar baby of mine.
Welcome back. We're staying in under construction because I've actually started a second project, or I'm about to, which I announced last episode. It's the V-neck version of the Jenny jacket by PetiteKnit, and I'm making it for my best friend, Antonia. So just to remind you, this is what the cardigan looks like. It's oversized and it has an all-over smock pattern covering the body and sleeves. I've actually never done smocking before, so this was exciting for me. And the cardigan is worked top down and in one piece. It's also drop-shouldered, but uses German short rows at the back to create a gentle slope along the shoulders. And this creates a cleaner fit around the shoulders compared to the traditional 80s drop shoulder, which is a simple rectangle. So I'm really excited about this project. I'm really happy to be knitting something for Antonia, finally. And this is the yarn that I'm going to use. Oh, this one. This is the Soft Silk Mohair by Knitting for Olive in the colour Dusty Rose. And initially I planned to combine it with their merino in the same colour, but I didn't read the yarn recommendations properly enough. So I'm making mistakes all over the place.
Oh my.
So PetiteKnit recommends using the Soft Silk Mohair by Knitting for Olive together with the Thun Per Gunt by Sandnes Garn. I thought I could just replace the Thun Per Gunt with the merino, but it turns out the merino is a lot thinner than the Thun Per Gunt. So because I've made so many mistakes lately, I want to increase the odds for this beautiful cardigan to be a success and an easy, quick knit. Yeah. That's why I decided to order the Thun Per Gunt as well. And this is it here.
And that's a perfect colour match, really.
It is.
Really lucky.
You helped me to find that. Yeah. Thanks, Mum. Yeah, so I'm happy with this. I will show you my swatch in a second. So this works well, and I won't let this beautiful merino go to waste. This, I'm also going to make a top for Antonia, probably a summer top using this merino because it's very soft.
Yeah.
It's nice on the skin. Yeah, so I also decided to be responsible and make a gauge swatch, which you can see here. And yeah.
You got better with your smocking over time, didn't you?
I did.
Because you have
get better,
to decide how tight you're going to do these wraps.
That's true. I did get better with the smocking. So usually I actually prefer tightly knitted fabrics, and so often I'll go down a needle size because I just think they look neater, but they can also be stiffer. And since this is going to be a drop shoulder cardigan, I tend to think that for them to look elegant, it's better to go for a drapier fabric.
Yeah, because it's similar to this one, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. I actually, so this is my Good Grandpa cardigan, which has a very similar construction to the Jenny jacket. And much like the Jenny jacket, the recommended yarn for this cardigan was a drapier blend. So it was a blend of merino, alpaca, and mohair. I went for the Fleece and Harmony, the signature Aran yarn in the colorway Autumn Birch. I love this yarn. But it's 100% wool, and so it's less drapey. And I also went down a needle size, like I said, because I like the tighter fabric. And that just means that my fabric ended up being stiffer than the recommended yarn would have made it.
Yeah.
But I'm happy with that. That's no problem for me. The only mistake I made was that I didn't account for the length changing with a tighter gauge. So my sleeves actually, well, my armholes ended up being a bit too tight. But we solved this problem by widening the button band, which sort of makes the cardigan fall further down the sleeves.
Yes.
And now I've got way more space along the armholes.
Yeah.
So that problem was solved.
And this is actually gorgeous. And you get a lot of comments on this.
I'm really constantly wearing this,
I love the way this has turned out.
Yeah. So even though this was a success, I want to avoid any potential problems with the Jenny jacket, which is why I'm going for the recommended gauge and with the recommended yarns. I'm playing it safe.
Oops, that's the wrong side.
Yes, that one's a lot prettier.
She's going to love it. She's really going to love it.
Yeah.
Okay, so now it's time to take you to the south of France to see or to meet the designer behind YarnFlakes.
Hello, my name is Audrey Borrego. I am a knitwear designer from the southwest of France. I live in a small city surrounded by hills and mountains, which is not too far from the Mediterranean shore where I was born. Like a lot of knitters in their 30s, I learned the craft mostly on the internet. I did get the basics taught by my grandmother as a child, but then I got very interested and researched everything online, discovering techniques on blog posts and videos. What I look for in my designing is to bring balance. I concentrate on picking stitch patterns that are engaging and can be the main feature of a project. I use a lot of different techniques, lace, texture, color work, combining things to have an eclectic style. You'll find lots of twisted stitches and geometric patterns in my designs, and I have prepared a few to show you. Stitch dictionaries are a great resource for me. I love to gather inspiration and combine and modify stitch patterns to fit my idea. I love Japanese lace in particular and will often use it as a base to build upon. Since it's usually heavily detailed and intricate, I can remove elements and get a smoother, airy fabric, which is what I did here with my oleander design, which is the pullover that I'm wearing. Now, this is a rather delicate lace pattern combined with a relaxed shape, which is something that I really love doing. It allows me to make a more involved statement piece, but still wear it in a simple outfit. This is a bottom-up design and it uses the scalloped edge of the lace at the start, but I have added an option to add a half-twisted rib hem. It has 3/4 loose sleeves and a V-neck. The lace is fully charted throughout the different sections and sizes of the design, so it really feels like building simple elements that are easily assembled with a 3-needle bind-off on the shoulders and picking up stitches with the V-neck and the sleeves. Yarn choice will also play a big role in this, as you want something that stays light and flowy without too much drape, which would drag the lace down. Another example of how I like to combine stitch patterns is the Fedra pullover. This is another bottom-up design which feature a texture panel on the front and a dotted stockinette fabric on the rest of the sweater. Now, I used to dislike bubbles. They made an odd impression on me, so I forced myself to design with them to figure out why and to find a way to make them work. And I realized that when I used bubble combined with twisted stitches line, they made more intentional shapes like leaves. They are part of a structure. And I also use a special bubble technique. They are not traditionally knitted bubbles. Instead, I've adapted a crochet bubble, which is made by creating many stitches into one before passing them over and securing it at the wrong side. This makes a smaller, softer bubble, which works really well with the fabric here. I have used Knitting for Olive's merino and mohair combined, and the light fingering weight in the merino really keeps the fabric light despite the decay gauge, and I have accompanied that with a more open neckline. A simple shape like this also allows me to incorporate modifications that some knitters might need for their body types. For example, here you can work horizontal bust-outs on the front. They are made by using short rows on either side of the texture panel to add more length to the front and avoid the hem riding up, which is something that a lot of knitters with a larger bust find happening with sweaters. The basic drop shoulder construction works as a canvas for me to build patterns upon. It balances intricate designs well, but it also helps me to place things. It gives me room, like in this project, the Figures cardigan. This is a colorwork cardigan worked from the bottom up and sticked at the front, armholes, and the neck. I wanted a sort of classic outdoors jacket style with a fitted round neck and comfortable sleeves fitted at the cuff. This features an all-over geometric motif, which, despite being mostly horizontal and vertical lines, are sort of staggered in a random, non-strict way. The simple shape allows you to get familiar with the techniques, sticking, catching floats, maintaining the colorwork pattern, without worrying about doing too many things at once. This is why the shoulder slope is worked in half-twisted rib. It adds a texture interest, but mostly it helps with placing shaping outside of the stranded knitting. I have been making mystery knit-alongs for a few years now. I wondered how to really play with the surprise element of it, and I came up with a simple concept. I make long colorwork tube cowls. This is Dédale, which is named after Daedalus, the architect from Greek myth who invented the labyrinth. Daedalus was in charge of trapping the Minotaur, so he created a maze, and this is exactly what this design represents. Dédale is the French version of his name and is still a synonym for labyrinth today. Here you can see the lines, which represents the walls running through the cowl with ornamental details and scenery along the way. This is started with a provisional cast-on, worked in the round and grafted close at the end. The pattern also includes additional motifs which you can incorporate at the base of the labyrinth at the entrance and or exit, which allows you to lengthen the cowl without breaking the pattern. I love spring and summer knits because it gives me an opportunity to play with plant fibers and their gauge. Yarn choice is another element of my designs which I like to emphasize on. You can achieve a lot of variety by using a different yarn and working it a certain way. This is Cintara, a simple raglan tee with an all-over texture on the body. The fabric reminded me of dragon scales, and you may recognize the name from one of Robin Hobb's fantasy book series. The armor-like result is made by playing with fabric density, and you can achieve different looks thanks to the variety and flexibility of plant fibers. This is a 25 stitches per 10 centimeter gauge, but I have used a DK weight blend of cotton and hemp. It makes a structured tee, but it's still soft and drapey thanks to the yarn that I have used. If you were to use a thinner yarn, it would make a lighter, more flowy tee. Another example of how a firm tension can really balance a drapey fabric is in the plain pullover. This is another all-over lace design featuring many different small panels of lace, including a honeycomb cable-like effect. This makes a 3D look by using eyelets, and I have kept the texture interest by working it at a tighter tension. This shows how you can still achieve a texture interest with a lighter fabric using a cotton and linen blend. I sometimes like to use texture for support as well as looks. These are the Myrène socks, which combine lace and mosaic knitting on the cuff. The slip stitch motif just below the open fabric are a fun look, but they also provide structure and keep a function to the sock. Another example of how texture can bring structure to a sock is with lace knitting. These are the Montélimar sock. They are named after a city in France which is known for its nougat, an almond candy bar. I thought the little bits of garter stitch looked like the chunks of almond shaped in the candy bar. This, combined with the lines of decreases, help keep the sock snug despite it having many eyelets. Working as a full-time designer for about 6 years now has helped me see what I like doing the most, which is building textures to create classic looks with visual interests. In the future, I plan to play a little bit more with the constructions that I used while keeping the process simple, playing with pattern placements and intuitive stitch sequences. Thank you for listening to me chat about my designs, and thank you so much to Andrea for welcoming me on Fruity Knitting. Goodbye!
Welcome back. So I really like Audrey's designs. They're very eclectic, as she said, and she does use every type of technique. And it was quite interesting when I was talking to her and we were preparing her segment to see how conscientious and detail-orientated she is. And she really does think a lot about how a stitch pattern can be used not only as decoration, but how it could be used as the fundamental structure of part of the garment. So where it might add support in certain areas or add more flexibility and drape in another area. And I haven't knitted with any of her patterns before, but I could imagine that they're very well written because she is so conscientious.
Yeah, I particularly love her cowl with the maze.
Yeah, I've got my eye on that. And the other one is the Phaedro.
I can't remember the
Pullover.
name.
That's the one with the bobbles on it where she makes the bobbles as part of a leaf structure.
Oh, yeah.
That's really beautiful as well. And Audrey is kindly offering Fruity Knitting patrons a 30% discount on all of her self-published patterns in her Ravelry store. And she really has lots of gorgeous patterns. I think she has at least 160. So enjoy looking through her shop, and thanks very much to Audrey for the generous discount.
One of the first things people assume when I tell them I'm a full-time YouTuber is that most of my time or work hours consists of knitting. And I wish this were the case. That would be an incredibly luxurious job. In reality, each of us works at least 40 hours a week, but usually more, and we get our knitting done outside of work hours. So our work is a little less cozy than some people might fancy when they first hear about it. But nevertheless, I think it's fantastic. I absolutely love my work, especially because no 2 days are quite the same.
Yeah.
I think that's typical for a small business, that everyone does a little bit of everything, and we're just two people. We have to, we're running a full business. So that means that your daily life is usually quite varied and interesting, and I really appreciate that about this work. So, as you can hear from this, fruity knitting is not only great fun, but it is also a lot of work, and it's our way of making a living. We're not sponsored by anyone, and we also don't make money through YouTube advertisements. So all ad revenues go to whoever owns the copyright of the music that we use in order to enhance the quality of our show. So if you find that this show brings you joy and adds value to your knitting life, we ask you to support Fruity Knitting financially as a Hebridean, Merino, or a Shetland patron. And you can do so starting at the price of just one coffee a month. And when enough of you do that, it makes a big difference for us.
Yeah.
So please support Fruity Knitting financially as a patron. Also, we want to say a great big thank you to all of you who do already support Fruity Knitting financially, because without you, Fruity Knitting could not exist.
Yeah,
Thank you for your support. All right, so coming up soon is our interview with Dr. Anne Kirketerp, the Danish psychologist. And Dr. Kirketerp has written a book called Craft Psychology. And we got to interview her last summer when we did our trip to Denmark, where we also interviewed people like Kamarose and Knitting for Olive. I actually got to do this interview because I studied psychology at university, so I was really excited about that. Beforehand, of course, I read Dr. Kirketerp's book, where she discusses the benefits of knitting and other handcrafts on our mental health. And she uses, amongst other things, psychological theories to explain these effects, which I really enjoyed because they relate to what I learnt at university. I want to give you a brief overview of some of these theories to help you get even more out of the upcoming interview. Now, one of the theories that Dr. Kirketerp mentions is called self-determination theory. The theory says that as humans, we have three basic psychological needs that have to be met in order for us to achieve mental well-being. These needs are the need for autonomy, competence, and connectedness. Autonomy means we are free to choose our behaviour and goals. So in knitting, this need is satisfied when we get to make decisions on what our project will look like, including the garment type, colours, and yarns we use, and whether we want to modify anything from the original design to fit our personal preferences. And of course, if you are designing something yourself, you have a lot of autonomy. Competence is our need to feel capable and effective in our actions. So do you think that you have the necessary skill and knowledge to knit yourself a beautiful colourwork sweater that fits you perfectly? Or are you half expecting it to be an unfinished project lying in the corner of your craft room? Knitting can also satisfy our third fundamental need, which is the need for connectedness. We want to make an emotional connection to the people around us and feel like we're important to them. And one of the ways we do this is by knitting for our loved ones, like I discussed in the previous episode. But you can also fulfill the need for connectedness on a larger scale. For example, some knitters are passionate about keeping old knitting traditions alive. In episode 124, we interviewed Alex Bird, who has Estonian heritage, and she published a book on traditional Estonian knitting patterns with a modern twist. Mum also interviewed the two Shetland sisters, Anne Junsen and Kathleen Anderson, who still knit traditional Shetland fine lace shawls. So those first two basic needs for autonomy and competence often go hand in hand, meaning the more competent you are, so the more techniques you know and the better you get at fixing your mistakes, the more freedom or autonomy you have to make the sweater exactly how you want it to be. And when you feel competent, this also gives you a sense of security and makes you feel calmer. So if everything else in your life has just gone haywire, being able to take a short break and do some knitting where you do feel more in control can just help you to calm down and reduce stress. And another thing I was thinking about was how people who push themselves in sports, they often become more confident in other areas of their lives as well. And this is because they keep taking up new challenges and proving to themselves that they can get better at something. And I believe we can do the same thing when we challenge ourselves with our knitting. And the good news is that there are thousands of knitting patterns out there, so you'll definitely find one that suits your style and also perfectly matches your skill level. So that means that the pattern is challenging enough to require your full attention, but it's not too challenging to get you all frustrated and want to give up. And if you match these conditions, then you might be lucky enough to enter a state of flow. And flow is something that Dr. Kirketerp also talks about in detail. Now, flow basically describes when you're totally in the zone while you're doing something you enjoy, like knitting. And during flow, you are highly focused on the task you're doing. You feel very in control or competent, and you lose track of time. You also don't get distracted by your thoughts and environment. But there are certain conditions for getting into flow. One of these conditions is that the difficulty of your project must match your skill level. So it can't be too difficult or too easy. It has to be exactly challenging enough so that your mind is fully involved in this one task in front of you. So if the technique or pattern is very new to you, or you keep making mistakes that you have no idea how to fix, then you're less likely to fulfill this condition. And the same thing goes for if you're trying to improvise or make modifications, but have very little experience in doing so. Yeah. So another condition is that you need a clear goal and immediate feedback. And these two conditions are generally fulfilled once you just follow a pattern and you've read through it once or twice and you understand it. But even if you're freeform knitting or you're just making things up as you go, for flow, you still want to have an overall clear goal. Like, I'm going to knit a long sleeve top that's fitted. It's also helpful to have a peaceful and distraction-free environment, as Dr. Kirketerp will talk about later, because you want to be able to fully focus, and hanging out with friends who like to ask you questions or start chatting suddenly, or having any other potential distractions around you can break your flow. So that's why it's also good to get any pesky tasks like cleaning the kitchen out of the way so that when you sit down to knit, your mind is fully at peace. And according to Dr. Kirketerp, experiencing flow has several benefits. These include that we become more creative and we also learn faster, but the brain also releases dopamine and serotonin, which helps us cope with negative stress. So that's really interesting. Later on in the interview, Dr. Kirketerp also talks about how she would like doctors to prescribe handcrafts to their patients, just like they can prescribe exercise. And she's not saying that handcrafts like knitting are suddenly a cure for mental illnesses or any other medical conditions, but they can help to alleviate certain symptoms. And many medical conditions have these certain symptoms in common. So conditions ranging from chronic pain to depression will have symptoms like mental stress, anxiety, or ruminating thoughts in common. And knitting can help to alleviate that. Yes, and another advantage of knitting is that unlike with physical exercises or relaxation exercises like meditation, I think people are more likely to get excited about handcrafts and therefore stick with them. And a big problem in medicine is a lack of patient compliance. So this means that the patient is given medication, but they don't take it the way they're supposed to, or they don't implement the lifestyle changes that the doctor recommended to them. And Dr. Kirketerp argues that this will be less of a problem with handcrafts because they're passion-driven. So, in conclusion, knitting isn't going to make everything in your life all hunky-dory, but it can be a very helpful tool to help to calm and focus your mind on something wholesome. I had a lot of fun reading Dr. Kirketerp's book and I learnt a lot from it. I've only just touched upon some of the interesting topics. We will talk more about them in the upcoming interview, but Dr. Kirketerp goes even deeper in her book. So if you like psychology, I can definitely recommend reading it. So Dr. Kirketerp's book is currently being translated into English and it'll be released on the 23rd of May. Dr. Kirketerp is kindly making one of the chapters available for our Fruity-Knitting patrons as a free download. So you will be able to get an early taste of the book this way. And I think this is a great offer because it's such an interesting topic. So thank you very much to Dr. Kirketerp.
So now it's time for the interview with Dr. Kirketerp, which I'm sure you're going to enjoy. It's time for us to say goodbye, and we'll see you again next month with a very special episode because we're going to be covering the Swiss Yarn Festival again.
Yeah. Thanks for spending time with us.
Bye.
Bye. Welcome to Fruity Knitting. We're in Denmark to meet Dr. Anna Kirketerp, and Dr. Kirketerp has spent the last 6 years researching the connection between psychology and crafting. So in this interview, she will talk about the health benefits of crafting and how knitting can be used to help manage mental and physical illnesses. And she's going to give us some tips on what we can do to reap the full benefits of knitting. Dr. Kirketerp, I'm very happy to have you with us today.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here, and do call me Anne.
I'll call you Anne.
Yeah.
Now, based on your research, you've written a book that connects psychology and crafting. But how did you first get interested in the topic, and what did your research consist of?
Well, I have 45 years of doing craft myself, and then I did a BA, a bachelor in craft, and I was a teacher in weaving for 7 years, and I could see all the benefits, and I thought I might as well be a psychologist in order to be a better weaving teacher. So I did a full BA and MA in psychology, and I became a psychologist, and I did a PhD, and that kind of spiraled me into academia, and I was a leader at the university for years. And then 8 years ago, I quit my job as a professor at the university, and I thought I wanted to make a more profound research in craft benefits or the well-being effects on craft. And I just found out that no one ever before collected all, you could say, the research or made a real research in what is the overall psychology of doing craft. So I asked 1,000 people, why do you do craft? And I got 200 very thorough answers. And I interviewed 30 people in depth, and I did what you could call a full literature review. And I found that, amazingly, you could say there was only 357 articles linking the thing, linking well-being, flow, crochet, knitting, woodworking, and all these kind of things. And that combined all of it, I could see that there was overall effects of doing craft, and that has 3 years ago, I made this book about craft psychology, which it formed into. And it is still amazing that after so many years that people have been doing craft, no one actually ever before, defined an area where you could call it craft psychology. So that's the thing. And my book just came out in English as well. So it's spreading. It's nice.
And from your research, you've developed a theory on how crafting improves our mental well-being. And part of your theory is that mental well-being results from feeling competent, connected with others, and in control of our lives. So I was wondering, how does knitting satisfy these three needs?
Well, it's maybe one of the most interesting things that I found, that it's very intuitively, people can understand that very intuitively, that when you have something that you love doing, you could call that you are intrinsically motivated. And that is what I would call having a passion. So the core thing of having a passion, it is actually the highest quality of life you can have, because when you have a passion or being intrinsically motivated, you are doing a task for its own sake. And when you do that, you will have this, as you call it, like these 3 psychological needs. That is, it's not a theory that I have come up with, is self-determination theory by DC and Ryan. And I could see that all these respondents, they talked about when they are engaged in a passion, they have these 3 needs met. And these 3 needs is like autonomy and competence and social relatedness. And feeling autonomous relates to that you have this sense of that you are wholehearted and you really love what you're doing, and you have this sense of freedom. And when people are, let's say, knitting, you have chosen the thing yourself. And very many of my respondents talked about that they had this bubble of own free time, that they are sitting in this bubble and loving it. And that is maybe one of the highest quality or really nice quality about having a passion, that you have this time where you can sit and you have 100% sense of autonomy over your time. So that need is kind of tick. And the other psychological need is the need for competence. And that's also the core of what people, when you can choose yourself, when you have the opportunity, you have like 100% autonomy and you can choose yourself. You would never go into a store asking, can I please have something where I would feel completely incompetent? You would never. You would always find something that maybe intuitively just perfectly fits your skill level, because you would find something that talks to you. So without any doubt, people who can choose themselves will also find themselves doing something where they feel completely competent.
And that also has to do with self-efficacy, doesn't it?
It does. And these micro-success experiences that you get when you are doing something that has the perfect level, and it also refers to flow that we should talk about later.
Yeah.
And when you have this perfect sense of competence and you have these micro success experiences, you feel gradually more and more competent. And that is the way that you gradually feel competent, is by having small success experiences.
And maybe for the audience, because we've studied psychology, but not everyone knows what self-efficacy means and why it's so important. No. Can you explain that quickly?
Yeah. It's Bandura's theory about self-efficacy, and it's the belief in future action is going to be successful. That you will, if you are doing something, maybe just beforehand you think, I can do this. And if you have the belief of that, then you will be much more likely to pursue something.
Yeah.
So that's very important. It's high self-efficacy is linked with almost anything good in life, because then if you think that you can change your life, you are more likely to actually do things.
Yeah, so that's a really great benefit of knitting, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
And if you think that you're a good knitter, if you think, oh, I can do this very difficult task, of course you will pursue it. But if you think, oh, I can't, you won't do it. And then you don't have the success experiences. So very many people have this high level of notion of competence. And that is also very difficult for very many people. You see other people in the YouTube or whatever, and you think, oh, they are so much better than me. But when you are voluntarily engaged, and you can choose your level yourself, you have these two needs met. And the third need that needs to be fulfilled in order to have psychological well-being is the need for feeling social related to someone, or feeling,
significant to others.
But it's both related to feeling connected to others, but also feeling connected to something bigger. And very many people who are doing craft, they have this sense of that they feel connected to all the other weird ones who are knitting. And that doesn't exist any kind of subgroup on the internet where you can't feel, oh, I'm one of the people who only knits in red. That's actually a group, a group of only knit in red people. And you can feel connected to someone, even though they're not in the room. And you can feel connected much easier when you have this common third, when you feel that you have something where you can sit and you don't have to talk. And there's a lot of research about also therapy groups where you can sit and feel that you can be quiet, and you can also feel connected without having to talk about your disease, or the disease is not what's defining you. It's actually, I'm sitting here knitting and I can withdraw, I can be quiet. And the other thing about connected or feeling this social connectedness is also that you can sit and do something. For instance, my parents, they are very loving, like you and your mom. And it's, they do a lot of things for me, and I can't really do anything for them. But I recently knitted a blanket. It took me 600 hours. And while I was knitting, I felt that I could, with each stitch, I could feel the love for my parents. So I felt very connected to them while doing it. And now my mom just turned 80, and they got the blanket, and she calls me all the time and says, oh, I'm looking at my blanket, and I'm just, really thinking about how much I love you. So it's this connectedness that you knit to others, and you love them, you think about them while you're doing it, and they think about you when they receive it. So it's the connectedness, feeling connected without or in space and time.
Yeah, I'm sure many of our viewers can relate with that. And speaking of friends and family, our friends and family often wonder why we become addicted to knitting.
Yes.
And this can partly have to do with a special mental state called flow.
Yeah.
So what is flow, and how can we achieve it? Maybe start off with a definition of flow.
Flow is about focused attention, and it's, for very many people, it's actually about attention, which people think that it's about the sense in your body, but it's about having used all your attention. We have 120 bits attention available per second. And when you are totally immersed in doing something very difficult, where your challenge and your skills are matched, and you have nice goals, and you have goals for it, you know what to do with it, and you have feedback from the material, that is when flow can occur. When people are referring to when was my life at the best, when was it like really perfect, is always being in flow people are referring to. And when the beautiful thing about having a deep passion and having the sense of being in flow is that there's so many biochemical effects of it. You feel every time that you have this challenge and you have skills and they are met, you forget everything about yourself, and you forget that you're hungry. And most importantly, that is maybe the core thing about why being in flow is so healthy, is because it cuts this default mode network. It cuts all your ruminating thoughts about, oh, I'm not good enough and I'm too bad at this. Because when you are in a perfect state of flow, you are totally immersed in an activity outside yourself. One of the other effects is that you can calm your body down, and people intuitively do that with repetitive movements. And one of the ways to understand that is that we have this network in our brain called default mode network. Mm-hmm. And it's all about trying to diminish future catastrophes. Yeah. So whenever people are doing nothing, they think that, oh, I'm going to relax now, but you will immediately have a very active default mode network, and you will start to think about, oh, what I'm going to do tomorrow, or am I too fat? Am I too whatever? Oh, I should do this and that, or this person or that person, because that is what default mode network is supposed to. It's supposed to hinder catastrophes to happen. So it's natural to have that very active when you only have impulses coming from inside. But as soon as you take something up in your hands, central executive network is active. And that is because whenever you're using some motor skills and you have to do something, default mode is completely cut, because it's a binary thing. So you can just actually, it's a little bit of a quick fix actually, though I don't like to talk about craft as a quick fix, but it is something where you sit and you just immediately take something up in your hands that preferably is in a float state, and you have absolutely cut every ruminating thought. And that is it's a very good effect that you can monitor yourself, and you can always have this control over your attention. Having to do something with your hands completely cuts default mode network.
And what other effects are there?
Well, maybe the biggest side effect of being in flow and having a passion is that is where you can have this upward spiral of positive emotions. And positive emotions, you shouldn't feel that, oh, I need to be happy all the time, because no one is happy all the time. We have an active...
We wish.
We wish. We don't have that. We have, unfortunately, humans are born with what we call negativity bias. And we have a 4 times as much tendency to be worried that as we have to be on a positive note. But when you do things where you are engaged and you feel, oh yes, this is so nice, and you have joy, hope, happiness, interest, all of what we define as positive emotions. So every day is actually about really trying to cultivate, as it's called, cultivate as many positive emotions as possible. And it's very obvious, almost as a banal thing to say, but whenever you are having a positive emotions, you don't have a negative one. So if you can cultivate half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours a day where you sit and you do something that you really love doing, and you're in flow and you feel competent and you have high autonomy, all the things. So the side effect is that you feel interested, hopeful, joyful, serenity, all the positive emotions. That is maybe the biggest good side effect of doing craft, that you can enhance your upward spiral of well-being. And you need to do that every day. Let the dishwashers last. Just let them be, and see if you have enough energy while you are doing, after you have done all your craft work. And it's not just for fun, but when you have the highest amount of energy when you come home from work or when you get up in the morning, that is where you should cultivate positive emotions and not try to do the dishes or whatever. And maybe 10 o'clock in the evening, you just fall down and you're so overwhelmed that you don't have enough energy to be engaged in something that will cultivate positive emotions and make your upward spiral. So it's really very important to do that when you have the highest amount or level or energy levels in your life.
Yeah. And do the advantages of crafting, do they ever vary based on whether we craft alone or with other people, or also whether our project is maybe more creative, where we make things up ourselves, versus recreative, where we follow, say, a knitting pattern or someone else's guidelines?
When I looked at my research, I saw a pattern forming. I saw that there was 2 dimensions, whether you are creative or you are recreating something, or whether you are alone or whether you are doing it with someone else.
Okay, so this is about how people pursue their craft.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's equally health benefits, or there's equal health benefits in each of the 4 quadrants. And maybe that's a little bit, new for some people, because we think that the high designer, the designer who are totally in flow and do everything themselves, and that is really high status. But being in a group, creating, knitting for prematures or something, is equally health benefits. It has equal health benefits. But there is, of course, something that you need to be aware of if you are in a group sitting and do a printed pattern for like the same kind of things for prematures, that you need to be aware that as an instructor, you need to be highly focused on saying that the next 30 minutes, let's be quiet. Otherwise, people can have the tendency of when they're in a group that they think that when people get in flow, some people think, oh, now it's quiet. And then they start, oh, what about your son? I hear that he was having this exam. So they fill out the space or the gap of silence, and then they interrupt people, and you cannot be in flow when you're interrupted. So I kind of, my big finger says that in a group, when you are recreating things, you need to be quiet and you need to set the stage as an instructor, or something that will make people be aware of that they can't just talk and have health benefits. Of course, it's nice to be in a group, but you can be in a group, have coffee afterwards and have all the benefits and still really have a high state of being in flow. But you need to have the space for it and say, be quiet for the next 30 minutes. Yeah. And then the other quadrants may be also to be aware of that when you are alone and also being recreative. That is where, for instance, a shirt like you have on, you have a ready-made pattern and you sit in your sofa and you love it and you're just tired after a long day. And if you only do that, you are too less or too little in a flow state. You just have this combined thing that you do. You need to maybe sometimes up your game a little bit and not just do too less flow generating things.
So that's basically a tip you're giving us. So you're saying, but I would have thought that depending on which quadrant you are, maybe different needs are more or less likely to be satisfied, or certain health benefits are more likely to be reached. Like you said, if we're in a group, then maybe we're less likely to get into flow, but we do have that social need.
Yeah. You could say that all kinds of effects like flow, positive emotions and calmness and having your achievement met, they are all met. But there are some things that you need to be aware of. So, for instance, this quadrant where you are social and you're recreating something, it's just, I can see that people are almost bragging about that. Oh, I have been in a knitting group, but we haven't done anything else but drinking coffee for 5 years. And of course, there's a social benefit of it, but you could add a little bit more very easily. That's the only thing that I've seen, because I've observed, I have been looking at very many of these knitting groups, and they are just, the tendency is that they talk too much. The quadrant where it's easiest to be in flow and have all the benefits is when you are creating, when you're totally creative and you're doing it alone. That's easy, but it's not something that everyone is doing, and you don't have to be a designer and design yourself to have all the health benefits. It's equally good to start a new sweater someone else did, and you can just be immersed in flow and have all the benefits. So all the quadrants could equally be health benefiting for you, but you just need to especially be aware of not be disturbed by others when you are together with someone else.
Well, I'm sure many knitters are relieved about that. Now, you've gathered all this knowledge. How can the medical profession use all of this knowledge to help manage mental and physical illnesses?
What I found was, interesting enough, you have 80,000 scientific papers on the connection between physical exercise and well-being. And in the contrast, you only have like 350 scientific papers on the link between craft and well-being. So, of course, it's so much easier for a doctor or a psychotherapist to prescribe exercise, physical exercise, as the answer to anything. Everywhere you see that. And that is my mission, or my end goal, is to have craft as you could call it medical craft, in the same way that everywhere when you do, if you are trying to see why is it that running or walking or lifting weight is healthy, you know exactly for how long time you should do it and how you should exactly do. If you have a sore spot here, you know exactly how to do that. And that is what I'm trying to do, is to see that craft could have the same specific broken down component. So I would know exactly how to prescribe craft as a medical thing. If you have anxiety, or if you have dementia, or if you have an eating disorder, so you know exactly how you should target it to a specific group of people.
That's really interesting, yeah.
For instance, there was this study in Finland that explained how what happens in your brain when you are making this from a 2D image to a 3D thing. Because the interesting thing is that this is the most complex thing that your brain can do when you are trying to translate a 2D image into a 3D thing. It could also relate to that you're remembering some sweater you saw on the street, and you have to go home, and then you have to, make the interpretations of what colors, what long, and whatever, and
also what stitches do I need to do in order to create the same pattern.
And that interpretation of an internal image to something 3D is immensely complex for the brain, because you also have all your how did it feel, and all your motor skills and everything. So it's a highly complex thing for the brain, and it really makes this neuroplasticity emerge in your brain.
Just quickly, for people who don't know what neuroplasticity is, that's when our brain, either through repeatedly doing something, the brain connections get strengthened, or because you like to talk about how we need to challenge ourselves, that's about learning and trying out new things, new synaptic connections in the brain get created because of that.
Thank you so much. So that is how you are increasingly getting shield from early onset dementia, because the brain works like that. If you don't use an area or a skill, it will gradually just disappear. And all these signs, all these research that the difference in Finland or otherwhere, they really touch upon that. It's the most efficient way for you to train your brain is if you have a high passion for something. You're very likely to be engaged in it in a long time, and it goes like a breeze to learn new things.
Yeah, and to keep doing it. That's really interesting, because often, even just with pills, doctors have the problem that patients don't comply. It's called patient compliancy, I think, something like that. They don't continue taking the medication that's been prescribed to them, and if they have passion, they're more likely to do it.
They are. Yeah. In almost every conditions, whether it's physical or mental illness, stress is the main component, whether it's if you have pain or whatever. So lowering the stress response in your body is a key thing that craft is really something that's very efficient to do. And that is mainly because it cuts your default mode network. And it produces this tranquil response in your body. And also because when you have something that you're very passionate about, you're more likely to do it in a longer time. So you're not just sitting and knitting for 10 minutes and then, oh God, I don't want to. So you have very prolonged time where you have all these very beneficial effects. And that's a good thing, because you are producing dopamine and you are leveling your serotonin levels. And that is the key thing, that you can have a prolonged experience of cutting your default mode, having a flow experience, having all these neurosystems like the parasympathetic nervous system up and running. And that is so easy for most people to really want to be engaged in craft, and therefore diminish your craft or diminish your stress levels. And it's so
crafting essentially is a really great tool to alleviate symptoms of stress that you can experience across different physical conditions. Like if you say have cancer and are sitting in a waiting room a lot and really nervous, that can help calm you down. Or if you have social anxiety and you're in the train. That's really interesting. It's very versatile, and you can take it everywhere. Now, through your research, you've listened to lots of people, I think 200 people, talk about how
more
crafting
than 200 people,
help them through personal crises and illnesses. What are some of the most memorable stories that you heard?
Well, there's so many wonderful stories, and especially one really stands out. It was this woman who had stage 4 cancer, and she told me that before she died, she wanted to make a sweater for each of her loved ones and family members. And it was just really touching. And she also had the time to give me all these tips and tricks on, if you have cancer, what kind of needle should you use and how heavy should the yarn be? And for instance, days when you're itching everywhere, what kind of yarn should you use? And so it was really like this refined knowledge of what is it that stage 4 cancer patients should knit, and how difficult should it be on a day where you're totally, really just worn out. And that is just amazing that I have been that's been such a gift to just be able to receive all these stories. So I'm really grateful.
Yeah. And you also, when we talked about this a little earlier, you said that it gave her a lot of meaning to be able to leave these projects to her loved ones, even after she'd passed, which reminds me of the needs that you talked about, the need for connectedness.
Yes. She now, recently died and passed away, and now all these sweaters are still there.
Yeah, that's a really special gift.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure many of our viewers are thrilled to have been given such great justifications for buying more yarn and spending even more time knitting. You've given us a lot of food for thought.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on Fruity Knitting and being so generous about sharing your knowledge with our viewers.
Yeah, it's been such a privilege to talk to you, and because you know so much already, so it's amazing.
It was a lot of fun reading your book.
Yeah, it's really been a privilege, so thank you so much.
Oh, you've been very welcome on the show. Let's say goodbye to the audience.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.